The next bill on the calendar for the day is House File 1538. The clerk will report the bill.
House File number 1538, number 5 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to real property, the first engrossment.
Recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. I'm very proud of this bill. I would like to thank everyone who's been involved in this year-and-a-half odyssey of work. I'm very proud of the list of supporters, including Representative Ray Dean, Representative Nelson as co-authors. I also would like to thank the cities of support that have provided resolutions that are being handed out right now, including but not limited to the City of Bloomington, Chanhassen, Edina, Golden Valley, Hopkins, Maple Plain, Newport, St. Anthony Village, St. Louis Park, Wayzata, and Woodbury. Additionally, members, the Minnesota Housing Options Coalition are supporting this bill. American Institute of Architects, the Association of General Contractors, the Association of Metropolitan Municipalities, the Builders Association of Minnesota, the Builders Association of the Twin Cities, Minneapolis Downtown Council, the Minnesota Association of Realtors, and the Minnesota State Building and Construction Trades Council. A full range of housing options are critical for the well-being of Minnesota. Since the end of the recession, construction of homes has increased dramatically, yet not the same for condos and townhomes. In 2007, 23% of the market were townhomes. In 2015, only 3%. Similarly, since 2007 to 2015, homes rose 80%, townhomes decreased 70%. This legislation seeks to encourage condo and townhome development by reducing the risk of litigation associated with these types of construction projects. It encourages all the parties to resolve their differences that are defect disputes through negotiations and mediations without impacting owners' warranty rights. I ask for your support.
Representative Hillstrom offers the following amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
Hillstrom moves to amend House File number 1538, the first engrossment, and the amendment is coded A2.
Recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Hillstrom, to introduce your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Members, one of the troubling parts about this proposal is that it requires a majority of the property owners to vote in favor of the beginning of a suit. Now, members, just as with stockholders or stakeholders in other areas, we usually require that there be some notice, and we require that they be told when a lawsuit is going to be voted upon. But we usually give the board the authority to actually take the vote on whether or not to file a lawsuit. So what's in this statute proposal currently really is a larger burden than we place on many other entities. And so all I am asking for in this amendment is to say you must notify all the property owners. You must tell them the date that you're going to vote, the board's going to vote on whether or not to file a lawsuit. You must tell them at least 30 days in advance. But once that is done, it really is the board who would make the determination on whether or not the lawsuit should be filed. So members, that's the amendment, and I ask for your support.
Recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. I oppose this amendment. Parts of this are very good and I support, but in a whole, I ask for a no vote. The entire bill, one of the main components is whether the board of directors is voting or whether the members of the association are voting. It is true the rules for this bill for these associations is different than a corporation such as 3M. But there's unique things happening in this industry that the list of supporters that I read previously recognize. Many of you have personal stories about this situation. This is different. I ask for your no vote.
Any further discussion on the A2 amendment? Seeing no further discussion, seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of adoption of the A2 amendment signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. The motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. Representative Dean R. offers the following amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
Dean R. moves to amend House File Number 1538. The first engrossment as follows, and the amendment is coded A17-0380.
Recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Dean R.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I believe there's an amendment to the amendment as well.
Representative Dean offers the following amendment to his amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
Dean R. moves to amend his amendment to House File Number 1538, the first engrossment, as follows, and the amendment to the amendment is coded RA17-009.
Members, as a point of clarification, Representative Dean pre-filed an amendment that was coded A17-0388, which contained a technical error. He has since brought amendment coded RA17-009. Pursuant to House Rule 3.33, paragraph E, the presiding officer has made a decision to allow that correction. So we are on that amendment that has the technical correction. And to introduce that amendment, the member from Hennepin, Representative Dean R.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for accepting the technical change. It was a critical change in the amendment to the amendment. And what this does is it changes the implementation date for projects that were constructed after July 1st, 2014. And why that date was arrived at is there are a lot of properties out there that currently the purchasers of those properties had bought them under certain contractual obligations in purchasing their projects, in their condos, in their buildings. And what the underlying original bill does is it actually goes backwards completely to sort of remove their contractual obligations through pursuing damages of claims as part of the association. And by changing the state, what I've done is I've tried to sort of meet in the middle. My original amendment had it being totally prospective, moving forward, so that those individuals that had purchased units are knowing, those that have already purchased those units would not be change of their actual purchase agreement that they had with the developer and the original building owner. By changing it to July 1st, we sort of come in the middle and realize that early on after we began construction, there were some projects that moved forward, and most of those projects, the defects have already been found out. They're already out there. So what this does is it goes back a few years and allows the opportunity for some defects that may not have been discovered yet to be considered under the new bill. And I appreciate this bill because we do have an existing difficulty in what's called the condo market. And that's having an adverse effect on the housing market as well. At the same time, I don't want to strip any of those owners of their rights that previously allowed them to make claims against building defects and problems. So I offered this amendment to the amendment, and I would hope that the body would support that in favor. Thank you.
Discussion on the motion to adopt the amendment to the amendment coded RA 17-009. The member from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I appreciate the author's amendment and amendment to the amendment and his work on this bill. This has been a collaborative effort, and there's been a series of compromises with the myriad of people involved in this. I'm going to ask for a no vote on this amendment. I feel that in order to properly get this market back to where it was, we need to go back for the entire 10-year statute of limitations. No one's right in court is being eliminated. No one's rights are being taken away. Insurance companies, architects, they need the assurance that we're going to be able to move forward in this market in a way that's going to give them the type of protections they need to get this market back. I ask for a no vote. Thank you.
Any further discussion on the amendment to the amendment? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of adoption of the amendment coded RA 17-009 signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The motion does not prevail and the amendment to the amendment is not adopted. We're now on the underlying A17 amendment. Representative Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. So without this date back to July 1st, I'm assuming that A17 will not be able to be added to this. But I just want to caution members that freeing up the market is a good thing to do, but how we do that is also important. I mean, very important, because we're about to take away the contractual rights of many individuals that had purchased units under a provision of law during the time that they purchased their condo units. So in voting against this amendment and then voting for that bill, we're voting to take away the rights of people that purchase properties, some of them at a time when the market was not quite back yet, and some of those at a time when the market was back yet. And we will be in essence nullifying the way in which they purchased their unit through these changes. So I would ask that members vote in favor of this amendment. Thank you.
Any further discussion on the A17 amendment? The member from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. I ask for a no vote. Thank you.
Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of adoption of the A17 amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted.
No more amendments.
There are no further amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File Number 1538.
Third reading. Discussion on House File 1538. The member from Ramsey, Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Smith yield to a few questions?
He will yield, Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Smith, there are concerns that have been stated, multiple concerns about the bill as written, and I've heard from various folks that they think that despite those concerns, this bill is kind of being sold as a panacea for the lack of condo builds that we're seeing. And the folks that I've talked to about this seem genuinely sincere in their belief that this bill will solve that problem. And I can tell you, members, this is my 15th legislative session now, and there are a lot of bills that come through here that are sold as panaceas, as cure-alls for how it's really going to solve a problem. And I think there might be only one I remember that did that. Who remembers the putting Sudafed behind the counter to stop meth labs? And remember that? Yeah, okay. I was cynical about that, and sure enough, like, meth houses in the years after that pretty much disappeared, which floored me. I mean, I thought it would work. I didn't think it would work that well, but from looking at the perspective of a prosecutor and law enforcement, I was very impressed with the results for that. Now, since then, of course, markets have changed. It's being produced in other places and still sent here, so, but it still drastically reduced the number of meth houses we had, of farmers getting stuff stolen out of their fields. But I have some concerns about that. So my first question I have, Representative Smith, is regarding the requirement that you have to get homeowners who have contracted for this to have to get their agreement to take legal action to protect their rights. Would you support a similar provision for corporations in Minnesota to require corporations to get the same amount of consent from their shareholders prior to taking legal action to protect their rights or interests?
The member from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, we had a long discussion about this bill in Civil Law Committee, and I understand your position. I would ask you to get out your calendar and mark today's date down, because this may be the second time in your long and distinguished legislative career that this bill will solve problems in the marketplace. In regard to your hypothetical question, I would need to see the language, but my answer, Representative, is that this is a unique problem, a unique industry, and we need to act. We deal with problems in different industries throughout our beloved state every time we meet as a body. This is one of those times that I believe we need to come together and solve this problem. This list of supporters, I will save you all reading all their names again. It is long. This has been a very long discussion of this bill, getting this in the shape that it's in. For those of you that have a particular interest in this bill, you may know that the version in the Senate is different, and this bill is going to go to conference committee. The discussions for compromise, modifications will continue. So, Representative, please get out your calendar. This may be the second one. Thank you.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hey, listen, Representative Smith, I'm open to be proven wrong, okay? It happened before, but I just think that I've been here 15 years, and like I said, a lot of it's sold that way. So I'll mark my calendar, Representative Smith, and maybe this is the second time in 15 years that I'm proven wrong on that. However, remember that this is a pretty drastic maneuver that we're taking at to suggest that it's going to solve a condo bill problem. We're interfering with people's right to contract. We're interfering, we're legislatively abrogating their due process rights. Those are two pretty big constitutional rights that I'm sure some of the Tea Partiers over there would care about quite a bit, especially the right to contract. But you had brought up, if Representative Smith would yield to another question, Mr. Speaker.
He will yield. Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Smith, you had brought up that list of the folks or the municipalities supported. I think I saw Chanhassen, Edina, Bloomington, might be a couple others. Did you receive a letter of support from any local unit of government outside the metro in support of this bill?
Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, there is not any documented support from outside the metropolitan area, but I know that there is support. And I know that your city of St. Paul really is interested in this bill. There's a development down at the old Ford plant that people are very encouraged that this bill becomes law to help out your beloved city. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker.
Representative Lesh.
Well, that's good. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Smith, that's good to know because they haven't talked to me about it. No one from St. Paul has talked to me about it. Now, here's what I tell you. I heard Minneapolis came and testified for it. Representative Anderson's not here, so she probably won't say anything about my wife now, who works for Minneapolis. But I know Minneapolis testified in favor of it. And I understand the reasons behind why some of these folks wanting it. It's just curious that your caucus has stated you're going to take care of Greater Minnesota. And I hadn't seen a whimper from Greater Minnesota about how this is going to help folks out there. But if Representative Smith would yield to a final question, Mr. Speaker.
He will yield. Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Smith, can you tell me how is the housing market doing overall in Minnesota right now? How are homes being built, or are we stagnating?
The member from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, the housing market is in a period of recovery since the Great Recession, and things are improving. But what's more important to your question is that we need to help out the condo and townhome development. These townhomes and condos for the low income and middle income, they are hurting. we need revisions in this area of the law to help them. That market is suffering greatly.
Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'll tell you how it's doing, Representative Smith. It's booming. It's a booming. And yeah, maybe not for condos, but the suggestion by promoters of the bill that that's because insurance companies and developers don't want to build something where they're exposed to liability in this way. I don't know. Maybe it's a market thing. Now, I'm a guy who supports housing density. There are bills that I voted with your side of the caucus on this year and in years past, and Representative Nash knows this, to encourage housing density. Okay, townhomes and condos are going to get you to density where single-family homes are not. So I completely support the principles of having those condos and townhomes built, where now single-family are getting built. But I'm just hard-pressed to believe that this is the way we go about it. And I can tell you, this is a banner year for insurance companies at the Minnesota Capitol. A banner year. You defer in favor of what insurance companies are saying. You swallow what they're telling you, hook, line, and sinker, instead of supporting your constituents' contract rights and due process rights. I could be proven wrong, Representative Smith, and I'm going to mark the date on my calendar. Okay, I'm going to talk to you in 2 years, too. And maybe you're right, and quite frankly, I hope you're right. I just don't think that this is the bill, this is the way to go about doing it. So I'm going to be voting no.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Dean R.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to reply to one of Representative Smith's comments, my amendment would have made St. Paul just fine in the Ford plant site. They would have been just fine moving forward. All the units that are going to be built there, they would have been just fine with that amendment. But you chose to vote it down. So again, this is going back and really giving individuals the opportunity to change the playing field that they built their properties on. And I'm a big supporter of the architecture profession. I'm a big supporter of general contractors. I'm a big supporter of all those folks. And yet, I look at this bill, and there seems to be a lot of dissension yet. We all can roll out, long lists of people that are supportive, and I think that that's important to do that. But at the same time, it's not just a one-sided issue. There's two sides to this issue. And if Representative Smith would yield to a question.
He will yield. Representative Dean.
Representative Smith, can you explain to the body exactly why making this retroactive for a 10-year period is going to somehow free up the market that currently is doing okay in housing? It's actually doing really, really well in apartments, but how it's going to impact the condo market?
The member from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, part of the genesis of this bill were frivolous lawsuits that have been going on. In the last year of the 10-year statute of limitations, frivolous lawsuits are being brought forward. This bill will prohibit the frivolous lawsuits from going forward. The people involved in the construction, the architects, those people, including people in the Trades Council, this bill will give them reassurance that moving forward, these frivolous lawsuits will stop going forward as well as going back. I want to point out a letter of support that some of you may not have seen. It's from Harry Melander from the Minnesota State Building and Construction Trades Council, dated April 26, 2017. This bill will be beneficial to all of Minnesota. This is a great bill. Thank you.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Dean.
So I don't think you really told us how it's going to affect the market. I mean, I would venture to guess that we will see a lot more developers moving into the condominium market. And I think it will be really, really good for them moving forward. What this bill is actually going to do, it's going to free up capital because it'll allow more capital to come in. It will also make insurance rates maybe better, maybe not. We always get promises from insurance companies that the things we do here will impact our insurance rates, and they seem to never really do that. But it will definitely relieve them of any liability that they currently are carrying for the past 10 years. And again, I'm really disappointed that you weren't willing to support the amendments that I brought forward, because I thought that that was trying to find that area of middle ground. And I think that for this bill coming back from conference committee, it's going to change, or it's not going to come back. And we've seen that happen with other bills that Representative Smith, has actually carried to conference committees in the past. And if this bill does not come back, we're going to be left in the same place we are today. And that's not going to help anybody. All the people that have signed on to support this, they're all going to be in the same place they were today. Not in a place that they could be by working together with both sides to get to that point where some people might be a little bit unhappy, but it's going to be people on both sides that are going to be a little bit unhappy. And I actually believe that the amendment and the amendment to the amendment would have had the same effect of freeing up financial capital, putting insurance companies somewhat at rest, although not completely at rest, with what has been going on the past few years. And I think that these lists that you handed out of, I guess it's about 11 cities, might be sitting in the same situation they are today. So I would encourage you, when you go to conference committee, to not be dogmatic of this bill and where it's at today, because my guess is given what is passed in the Senate, if you are dogmatic, this bill won't be coming back. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask folks to vote no.
Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If Representative Smith would yield to a question.
He will yield. The lady from Hennepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Smith, could you clarify for me, if I purchase a unit in one of these common interest properties, and there is a defect in my unit, and only in my unit, so a building defect in my unit, in order for me to file a lawsuit for the building defect in my unit, would I have to get 50% of the people that own other units to agree to allow me to sue on that building defect?
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, no.
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Smith, could you please clarify why it is based on the language of your bill? Because it's my understanding that the association would have to sue on my behalf, and that they would have to get a majority vote of the ownership.
Is the lady from Hennepin asking the gentleman from Hennepin to yield? He will yield. The gentleman from Hennepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, if the association is bringing the lawsuit forward, then the rules with the 51% and the other outlines need to transpire. If you're bringing the suit forward from you, the person, as you originally asked your question, then only you yourself would need to be in agreement with that.
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if Representative Smith would yield to another question.
He will yield. The lady from Hennepin.
Representative Smith, could you tell me then, if 10 people had problems with their units, but no one else did, could those 10 get together and file like a class action lawsuit to deal with the defects of the construction, or would that be precluded by these provisions in this bill?
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, if they're listed individually, whether one at a time or as a group, as long as they're not a part of the association, then they can bring that suit forward without the 51%.
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So if Representative Smith would yield to another question.
He will yield. The lady from Hennepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So Representative Smith, say every single person that owned a unit wanted to sue because there was a defect with the construction of it. Would this preclude them from getting all together and deciding to sue not as the association, not as the board of directors, but individually they could all sue the contractor, even if it's every single unit, and they would not have to go through the board of directors at all?
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, if they were listed individually and they were for issues impacting their individual unit, then they could do that. If it's for common areas, then the association would need to be involved.
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So that's what I was getting to now. Representative Smith, if you would continue to yield.
He will yield. The lady from Hennepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So Representative Smith, based on what you said, what you just commented on the floor, if, for example, the roof of the common area leaks or is defective, and then it damages my unit, the association would have to file that suit, and that could only happen if 50% of the owners of the units voted to do that. Is that correct?
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, it depends on how the claim was written, perhaps.
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So members, I'd like to build things. I usually vote in favor of housing. I support housing. But I also believe that people should have the right to file a claim when they rightfully have one. And one of the things that happens in some of these proposals is that for the good of others, some people lose their rights and their protections. And members, this body has taken a pretty strong stance for property rights. And what this bill says now is that you, as an owner of one of these units, if you're harmed by the other, the common area, your property is damaged, you have to get 50% of the people that own that building, that own ownership in that, to decide to let you do the right thing. So members, that's really where this starts to get to be a problem. When you place the burden so strongly on getting even 50% of your neighbors to come to the meeting to hear that you have a problem, first you have to get them there, and then they have to all vote to agree to a suit, or 50% of them have to agree to a suit, you end up limiting someone else's property rights. So Representative Smith, I have just one last question for you, and then I'll sit down. But Representative Smith, these common ownership interests are allowed to place things in their contracts when they sue the property. They're allowed to decide who's going to be responsible for snow plowing, or who's going to be responsible for general maintenance, and purchasers contract for that when they buy it. Would this provision prohibit the buyer and seller from placing language in the bill that would say you don't have to have 50% to file a lawsuit on behalf of the interests in your property, or would that be precluded by this statute at purchase?
The gentleman will yield. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, could you restate your question, please?
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The question is, Representative Smith, we allow people who are going to buy and sell property to contract for who's going to be responsible for different provisions. And when you buy the property, you get to read the contract about what you're allowed to do and what you're responsible for. Would the language in this bill keep the seller of the property from placing a provision in the bill which would not require the 50% vote to file a lawsuit on these kinds of claims?
The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, it depends somewhat on exactly the language that you're speaking to. These hypotheticals are good for the discussion to understand the bill. It does depend a little bit on the hypothetical. Probably not.
The lady from Hennepin, Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And so, members, I just want to make that real clear. That's the way I read the language as well, based on the common interest ownership provisions, that if you put in statute that it requires a 50% vote of all of the owners, this statute would preclude contractors, the person who builds it and sells it, and the person who buys it from contracting for the rules to be differently, thereby giving up your personal property rights.
Discussion to the bill. The clerk will take the roll. The clerk will close the roll. There being 108 ayes and 23 nays, the bill is passed and its title agreed to.